Outpost 31 sat on the frozen moon of Aegis II like a wound cut into ancient ice and kept alive by machinery. It was not a place built for comfort. It was built for extraction, containment, and survival in a landscape so cold it could crack exposed steel. Beyond the reinforced walls stretched a dead white wilderness of jagged permafrost, black stone, and storms that could erase a man in minutes. Inside, the outpost lived by the hum of life support systems, the hiss of pressure seals, and the constant vibration of heavy industrial equipment working against a world that wanted everything frozen and silent. 3 decks below the main research ring, silence had been broken by discovery. The excavation crews had first thought they had uncovered an unusually dense mineral formation trapped beneath glacial rock. The shape was wrong for that. Too symmetrical. Too deliberate. Once the deeper ice was cut away and floodlights were lowered into the chamber, the truth became impossible to deny. Something enormous had been buried there for longer than civilization itself. The first dating passes returned results so old that half the science team assumed the instruments were compromised. They were not. Carbon dating suggested the creature was more than 2 million years old. Now it lay inside a specially built cryogenic pit beneath layers of frost, vapor, and reinforced shielding. Official reports called it a biological specimen. No one who had actually seen it believed that description. The thing in the chamber was too complete, too unnatural, too intact to feel like a fossil. Even frozen, it did not look dead. It looked paused. Its scales were matte black, swallowing the observation lights instead of reflecting them. Its folded limbs ended in hooked talons longer than combat knives. Its head was angular and predatory, all ridges, heavy jaws, and dormant violence. It looked less like an animal and more like an answer to a question nobody sane should have asked. Dr. Thomas Harding stood behind the 3-foot-thick observation window and stared down at it with tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had spent his career studying impossible things, but this one had never felt like a scientific triumph to him. It felt like a warning no one in corporate management was willing to hear. Thomas knew the cryogenerators were functioning. He knew the chamber was stable. He also knew that stable did not mean understood, and Hastings Interstellar had already begun treating the distinction as irrelevant. Working security alongside the human staff was a contingent of alien mercenaries humans had nicknamed the Silicuts, towering bipedal beings with hardened carapaces and a rigid warrior culture that treated fear as a flaw to be mastered. Their chief, a 7-foot veteran of the Orion skirmishes, went by Victor. His second-in-command was Gideon. These were not creatures easily shaken. They had fought on burning worlds and survived battlefields that would have broken most human soldiers. Yet every time Victor stood at the observation glass and looked down at the frozen dragon, his mandibles clicked in a small, involuntary rhythm Thomas had learned to recognize as something far worse than discomfort. It was ancient fear. Genetic fear. The kind of terror that reached deeper than reason. Your corporate masters do not understand what they are holding, Doctor, Victor had told him once in that deep synthetic baritone produced by his translation caller. In our oldest carvings, from before we achieved spaceflight, there are beasts like this. They do not hunt for sustenance. They hunt to silence the world around them. If it wakes, there will be no evacuation. Thomas had sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and answered with the same line he kept giving everyone, including himself. The Sullivan-Finch cryogenerators are pumping liquid helium into that chamber at a constant rate. It is essentially in suspended animation. It is not waking up. Even while he said it, the words had felt thinner than he liked. But Thomas was exhausted, and exhaustion made even intelligent men cling to whatever order they could still pretend existed. A year earlier, his wife Clara had died from a sudden autoimmune failure that medicine had not stopped. Since then, he had been raising their 5-year-old son Leo alone on this miserable ice rock because Hastings paid well enough to make bad decisions sound practical. Leo was a quiet, deeply observant child with an almost unnatural calmness. He wandered the sterile metallic halls of the outpost carrying his favorite possession, a worn stuffed golden retriever named Barnaby. Because of strict quarantine protocols, Leo had never seen a real dog. His world consisted of men in hazmat suits, towering alien warriors who carefully avoided stepping on him, and the endless mechanical hum of the colony's systems. That small innocent life was the sharpest contrast on the station. Because everything else was pressure. Hastings executives back on Earth were demanding live tissue samples from the creature. Engineers were being pushed to raise the chamber temperature just enough to thaw its outer dermal layers. Thomas fought them every step of the way, citing disaster after disaster, every historical example of human arrogance outrunning caution. It did not matter. His warnings had already started bouncing off polished corporate ambition. Somewhere above science and below greed stood Arthur Sterling, the site director, and Thomas knew the man well enough to understand exactly what would come next. The outpost was becoming a pressure cooker. The frozen dragons slept below. The company wanted more. And no one with actual authority seemed capable of hearing the sound of catastrophe approaching. The pressure inside Outpost 31 had been building for days before anyone admitted it aloud. Hastings Interstellar had not spent billions excavating a perfectly preserved apex predator from 2 million years of ice just to be told it was too dangerous to study properly. The messages from Earth arrived wrapped in polished language about opportunity, breakthrough biology, and strategic value, but Thomas Harding heard only one thing beneath all of it. They wanted samples. They wanted results. And they wanted them now. Thomas stood in the lower conference room on a Tuesday morning, one hand braced against the metal table, the other holding a tablet full of thermal risk projections. Across from him sat Arthur Sterling, site director for Hastings Interstellar, a man whose corporate comm never seemed to crack until danger became immediate and personal. He wore authority the way other people wore expensive coats. Smoothly. Automatically. As though it had been tailored for him. Behind him, two engineers kept their eyes on the table, trying very hard to look like men who would not remember this meeting later. "We need a viable sample, Dr. Harding," Sterling said. "The board is no longer interested in hearing why it cannot be done." Thomas dropped the tablet onto the table hard enough to make one of the engineers flinch. "Then the board should come here and explain why it wants to thaw the dermal layers of a creature that even our alien security team treats like an ancestral nightmare." Sterling barely glanced at the data. "The chamber remains stable." "It remains cold," Thomas snapped. "That is not the same thing. You are assuming its biology works like standard carbon-based life. It doesn't. The density mapping is wrong. The thermal retention is wrong. Its internal structures don't behave like anything in our catalog." Sterling leaned back in his chair. "Our instructions are clear." Thomas felt his temper pushing against his ribs. "I cited Chernobyl in my last report. I cited the Bowl plant failure. History is full of corporations deciding that technical warning signs are inconvenient. You are following the same script." Sterling's expression hardened by a fraction. "Drop the core temperature by 3 degrees. That is an order." For a second, the room seemed to hold still. Thomas knew exactly how small 3 degrees sounded to people who did not understand what they were touching. That was the problem. Tiny changes felt safe to men who mistook numbers for control. "No," Thomas said. Sterling rose slowly, smoothing his jacket with one hand. "Your refusal is noted. It is also irrelevant. Execute the adjustment." That was the moment the meeting stopped being an argument and became machinery. The order passed downward. Console permissions changed. Engineers moved. Somewhere in the lower containment sectors, the cryogenic control systems accepted a command Thomas had spent days trying to prevent. At first, it looked harmless. The chamber temperature shifted by only a fraction. The outpost monitoring boards showed slight changes in external thaw rate, well within the margins Hastings had assured everyone were manageable. Engineers began speaking in the falsely calm tones people used when they wanted a bad decision to sound technical instead of reckless. One even muttered that the outer tissue response would probably take hours. It took minutes. The Hastings engineers had assumed the dragon would wake the way ordinary life woke. Slowly, reluctantly, as systems restarted one by one. They did not realize the creature's internal organs operated more like a hyperpressurized fusion reactor than any known biological network. The moment the external ice thawed even a fraction, The beast's nervous system did not stir. It rebooted. Instantly. At 1400 hours, the primary containment alarms began to scream. The siren was a high-pitched oscillating shriek built to cut through heavy machinery noise, and it did exactly that. Warning lights washed the command center in violent strobing red. Thomas dropped his data pad, the screen cracking against the grated floor as he lunged toward the thermal console. "Report," he shouted. Jenkins, a young technician whose hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep them on the board, stared at the numbers in front of him as if they had become a foreign language. "Generators 1 through 4 are failing. The thermal output in the chamber, it's impossible. It's spiking to 600 degrees Celsius." Victor stepped forward, his massive hands gripping the edge of the console. Through the thick plastisteel observation window, the containment pit had vanished behind a cloud of blinding white steam. The ice was not melting anymore. It was sublimating, flashing from solid to gas in an instant. Then a sound rolled through the outpost. Not a roar. A deep, resonant hum so low in frequency that Thomas felt it in his teeth, his bones, and the fillings in his skull before his ears fully processed it. Around him, loose tools rattled. Someone whispered a prayer. Victor's mandibles clicked once, hard, and then a massive obsidian claw slammed against the reinforced window. Spiderweb cracks shot across the reinforced plastisteel window from the point of impact, impossibly deep and impossibly fast. For one frozen second, nobody in the command center moved. Nobody breathed. The obsidian claw on the other side of the glass remained pressed against the bowed surface like a piece of living night, steam coiling around it in violent white sheets. Then Gideon whispered, "It cannot be," and for the first time since Thomas Harding had met him, the towering alien looked small. A pungent scent filled the room. Thomas did not know the Silicate language well, but he knew what that smell meant because Victor had once explained it with visible disgust. Pheromones of absolute panic. Not nerves. Not caution. Biological surrender in the presence of an overwhelming predator. The security aliens were not merely afraid. Something buried so deep in their species' memory it predated reason had just taken control. "Seal the blast doors." Arthur Sterling screamed, all corporate smoothness stripped from his voice. "Lock down Sector 4. Vent the atmosphere in the chamber. The ventilation shafts are melting." Jenkins cried, tears already streaming down his face as his hands skidded uselessly across the console. Another impact hit the window. The plastisteel bowed inward. Victor turned to his men and drew his plasma rifle, a weapon powerful enough to burn through lightly armored vehicles. "Fall back to the primary corridor. Form a defensive line. If it breaches, we fire until the cells are empty." He was trying to sound like command again, but Thomas heard the tremor in his synthetic baritone. Even Victor was fighting to hold himself together. The other silicates did not look much better. Their mandibles were locked. Their limbs were too rigid. The humans in the room were not faring any better. Security contractors unholstered rifles with pale faces and shallow breath, every posture in the room vibrating with animal fear. Then the window exploded. The blast tore outward in a hail of jagged shrapnel and blistering heat. Thomas threw an arm across his face as fragments ripped through consoles and slammed into the far wall. A shockwave rolled through the command center, hot enough to make the air itself feel skinned raw. Through the clearing steam, the dragon pulled itself up from the containment pit. Thomas had spent weeks studying scans and frozen images, but none of them had prepared him for motion. The beast was not merely large. It was wrong in ways the human brain resisted. Its scales absorbed the emergency lights so thoroughly it looked like a void cut into reality. Its molten gold eyes burned through the red strobing haze with patient, predatory awareness. It climbed the sheer metal walls with terrifying serpentine grace, 6 limbs finding purchase where no weight that immense should have held. It did not attack at once. That made it worse. It raised its angular head and tasted the air with a forked, flickering tongue, assessing the room, measuring threat, finding only prey. Victor fired first. A searing bolt of blue plasma struck the beast square in the chest. The shot would have punched through tank plating. The dragon did not even flinch. The plasma dispersed harmlessly against its armor, leaving not so much as a scorch mark. The creature turned its burning eyes toward Victor and let out a low hiss that sounded like tectonic plates grinding together. Loose bolts rattled from the ceiling. Panic finally broke. Sterling bolted for the emergency exit, shoving a technician out of his path. Human guards opened fire with kinetic rifles, and the rounds sparked off the dragon's hide like rain striking concrete. Then the dragon moved. It was too fast. Its tail swept through the room in a blur of black force, shattering consoles and sending 3 guards flying into the far wall with sickening crunches. Gideon, paralyzed by the same ancestral terror that had already hollowed out the rest of his species, dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, exposing his throat in a reflex of ancient submission. The dragon ignored him completely, stepping over the cowering alien as if he were loose debris. Thomas scrambled backward, every rational thought collapsing into one brutal instinct. He had to get to Leo. As the beast tore through the reinforced steel doors of the command center like they were wet cardboard and vanished into the main arterial corridors of Outpost 31, Thomas slammed his hand into the emergency lockdown override on the wall panel. Evacuation klaxons erupted through the station. He hit his wristcom. "Leo!" he shouted, stumbling into the corridor through smoke and flashing red light. "Leo, if you're in quarters, stay there. Daddy's coming." Static answered him. The dragon had already severed the primary communication conduits. The evacuation of Outpost 31 became less a retreat than a stampede. Alarms screamed without pause. Red lights carved long violent shadows down the corrugated walls. People ran with the desperate, directionless speed of prey. By the time Thomas reached the primary hangar bay, over 50 survivors were packed inside near the shuttles, a mix of engineers, laborers, and whatever remained of station security. Victor and a handful of his mercenaries had managed to throw together a flimsy barricade of cargo crates at the far side of the hangar. Thomas burst through the crowd, coat stained with soot, eyes wild, and grabbed the nearest technician by the shoulders. "My son," he said. "Where is Leo? Did the residential block evacuate?" The technician shook his head frantically. "I don't know, document. The blast doors shut automatically. Anyone who didn't make it out is trapped." Thomas felt the blood drain out of him. He turned toward the corridor again, ready to run straight back into the jaws of death. Then a small, quiet voice echoed across the vast hangar. "Daddy." Thomas froze at the sound of Leo's voice. He turned slowly, heart slamming against his ribs hard enough to hurt. There, near the loading ramp of Shuttle Alpha, stood his son in oversized blue pajamas, clutching Barnaby the stuffed golden retriever tightly against his chest. Somehow, before the lockdown had sealed the corridors, Leo had wandered into the hangar. For one blinding instant, relief hit Thomas so hard it almost buckled his knees. "Leo," he gasped, already moving. "Stay right there, buddy. Daddy's coming to get you." He got 2 steps. Then the blast-resistant doors leading to the engineering wing bulged inward. The metal groaned. Victor raised a trembling hand and aimed his plasma rifle at the door. "Do not move," he whispered, and for the first time Thomas heard the great alien warrior's voice crack. "It is here." The doors tore off their hinges. They flew across the hangar and smashed into a forklift in a shower of sparks and shrieking metal. Then the dragon stepped through. Inside the wider space of the hangar bay, its scale became fully real. It stood 15 feet at the shoulder, its long muscular neck weaving slowly from side to side, molten gold eyes fixed on the huddled mass of survivors near the shuttles. The silicates in the room dropped immediately, their bodies shutting down under instinct older than discipline. Victor, the bravest warrior Thomas had ever known, slowly lowered his weapon as his knees buckled. Thick tears of biological surrender rolled down his hardened face. The humans fared little better. The whole crowd was pinned in place by raw apex terror, trapped in the corner like animals in a slaughter chute. The dragon let out a low vibrating growl. It took a single deliberate step toward the survivors. But it was between the survivors and Leo. Thomas tried to move. He tried to shout, to run, to throw himself between the beast and his child, but his body would not obey him. The pressure radiating from the creature was suffocating, a living aura of predation so overwhelming it crushed thought beneath instinct. He could only stand there, every muscle locked, watching the one thing he loved most in the universe standing in the path of something built to end worlds. Then Leo moved. He did not scream. He did not run toward the shuttle or back toward his father. He walked forward. His small bare feet padded softly against the cold metal deck. Barnaby stayed tucked against his chest. He looked up at the towering obsidian nightmare with wide, curious eyes, not with terror, but with the baffled concern of a child trying to understand why something so large looked so upset. Leo had never known cruelty the way the adults in the room had. He had grown up among sealed corridors, recycled air, and holograms of Earth wildlife. To his uncorrupted 5-year-old mind, the dragon was not an extinction event, not a god of death, not a biological weapon from ancient myth. It was simply a very large, very frightening-looking animal that had been locked in a cold box for a very long time. "Leo," Thomas whispered. It barely qualified as sound. The dragon stopped. Its massive head lowered. Its burning eyes narrowed, focusing completely on the tiny figure walking toward it. Its mandibles parted, revealing rows of teeth that could have bitten through titanium. Hot sulphurous breath washed over the boy and fluttered the front of his pajama top. Behind Thomas, Victor squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch. He braced for the sound that everyone in the room thought was coming. Leo stopped 3 feet from the dragon's snout. The creature's head was the size of a ground transport, hovering just inches above him. It hissed sharply, a warning sound that made the air vibrate. Leo tilted his head and looked directly into those molten gold eyes. "You're sad," he said softly. The words hit the room harder than a scream would have. The dragon blinked. The violent twitching in its tail ceased. Leo lifted his arms and held out Barnaby. "You were in the cold room." "I don't like the cold room either." The beast lowered its snout further until it was almost touching the boy's chest. It sniffed the stuffed dog. Then it exhaled a deep gust of air that knocked Leo backward onto his bottom. Thomas lunged forward at last, breaking through paralysis, but caught a cable with his foot and crashed hard onto the grated floor. Leo did not cry. He giggled, pushed himself back up, and stepped forward again. Every human and alien in the hangar stopped breathing. Leo raised both small pale hands and placed them gently on the tip of the dragon's armored snout. The hangar bay went perfectly still. The alarms were still screaming. Red emergency lights were still strobing across the steel walls. Somewhere behind the survivors, damaged machinery was spitting sparks and smoke into the air. But for one impossible moment, all of that seemed to fall away beneath the sight of a 5-year-old boy standing in front of the deadliest creature anyone in the room had ever imagined, both of his tiny hands resting gently on the tip of its razor-armored snout. Thomas Harding stayed where he had fallen, one hand braced against the grated floor, too terrified to rise too quickly and ruin whatever impossible balance had formed between his son and the beast. Victor had opened his eyes again, but only just. The towering silicate warrior stared as though reality itself had begun malfunctioning in front of him. Around them, every guard, engineer, and laborer stood frozen in the kind of silence that comes only when people believe they are about to witness something too terrible to interrupt. Leo did not understand any of that. He only saw the dragon's eyes. They were huge and bright and frightening, yes, but they no longer looked angry to him. They looked hurt, confused, alone. "It's okay now," Leo whispered. His small hands patted the cold obsidian scales the way a child might comfort a frightened dog. Then, before any adult in the room could even imagine what he was about to do, Leo leaned forward, puckered his lips, and planted a soft, resounding kiss right on the dragon's nose. The universe seemed to stop. The dragon froze so completely that it looked carved from volcanic glass. For a creature engineered by evolution over millions of years into the ultimate predator, an organism that understood dominance, violence, and the hunt with perfect instinct, this was not merely unexpected. It was catastrophic. There was no place for gentleness anywhere in the architecture of its existence. No biological script for comfort. No inherited memory of kindness. A child had just offered affection to a being built only for destruction, and the beast had no idea what to do with it. Its molten gold pupils widened. A low rumbling sound began in its chest. Victor tensed so hard that his claws scraped the deck. He thought it was the prelude to an attack. Thomas thought the same for one hot, miserable second. But the sound deepened instead of sharpening. It spread through the floor in slow rhythmic waves, heavy and resonant, vibrating through metal grates and scattered tools. It was not a growl. It was a purr. A huge, thunderous, bass-heavy purr that shook the entire hangar without carrying a single note of aggression. The dragon's eyes slid closed. Its head lowered further, not in hunger, not in attack, but in surrender. Then, with extraordinary care for something that could have crushed a shuttle in its jaws, the beast leaned forward and rested the full armored weight of its chin on the deck directly in front of Leo's feet. It had bowed to him. Victor's mandibles twitched in absolute disbelief. Thomas, still on his hands and knees, felt tears blur his vision so hard he could barely see the impossible scene in front of him. The deadliest creature in the known universe had not been subdued by reinforced steel, plasma fire, or corporate containment systems worth more than entire cities. It had been calmed by a child in blue pajamas who simply thought it needed a hug. The silence in the bay was total except for the dragon's purring. Leo smiled. He pressed Barnaby, his worn stuffed golden retriever, against the beast's cheek. "See," he said brightly, glancing back over his shoulder with complete trust. "He likes Barnaby." To prove the point, the dragon let out a soft huff of warm air and nudged the stuffed toy gently with its massive razor-lined jaw. Its eyes remained closed in what could only be described as absolute contentment. The sight was so absurd, so completely detached from anything the adults in the room believed about biology, danger, or common sense, that nobody reacted right away. Their minds were still trying to catch up to what had already happened. Thomas pushed himself up slowly, every movement painfully deliberate. "Leo," he whispered, his voice shaking so badly he barely recognized it. "Buddy, it's time to come to Daddy now. Step away from it." Leo looked back at him, puzzled more than frightened. "But he's nice, Dad. He just had a bad dream in the cold box." Thomas took one agonizing step forward. The dynamic changed instantly. The dragon's eyes snapped open. The deep rhythmic purring stopped so suddenly it felt like the whole room had lost pressure. A sharp metallic click came from the back of the beast's throat. Its massive head rose, and in one smooth, deliberate motion it placed itself directly between Leo and Thomas. It did not lunge. It did not attack. But the message was unmistakable. Its 6 limbs tensed beneath its scales. It let out a low warning hiss. The line had been drawn. Thomas froze again, heart hammering. The dragon was not simply calm now. It had chosen. And somehow, impossibly, what it had chosen was Leo. From the back of the room, a voice whispered with sudden poisonous fascination. "Fascinating." Arthur Sterling crawled out from behind a reinforced cargo loader with soot on his suit and greed already replacing the panic that had ruled him seconds earlier. His eyes moved from the dragon to Leo to the armed security teams still half paralyzed around the edge of the bay, and Thomas saw the change happen in real time. Sterling was no longer looking at a disaster. He was looking at leverage. "It's imprinted on the boy," Sterling said, almost to himself. No one answered. He straightened slowly, mind racing ahead of his own survival instinct. The sudden temperature shift. The disorientation of waking after 2 million years. It's exhibiting extreme maternal or pack-bonding behavior. His voice sharpened with excitement. "It thinks the child is its hatchling." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. The room had just watched an extinction-level predator spare everyone because a child had shown it kindness. And Sterling's first instinct was still ownership. "Arthur," Thomas said very quietly, "do not do this." Sterling ignored him. "Victor," he barked, loud enough for the whole hangar to hear. "Have your men power up their plasma rifles. Aim for the soft tissue under the jaw. While it's distracted by the kid, we can put it down and salvage the carcass." The words landed like acid. Victor slowly turned his massive head toward him. Even with fear still working through his species' instincts, disgust now sat on the alien warrior more heavily than terror. His mandibles twitched once. "Are you malfunctioning, human?" Victor asked, his translated voice dripping contempt. To fire on that beast now would guarantee the child's death. It will not fall to a single volley, and its final act will be a reflex of pure destruction. I am giving you a direct order, Commander, Sterling shouted, pointing a shaking finger. That is corporate property. If we can't secure it alive, we secure the corpse. Fire your weapons. Before Victor could respond, the dragon did. The beast had heard Sterling's rising voice. It recognized the aggressive cadence, the sharp hostile energy behind it. To an apex predator, aggression directed toward its chosen pack was the final line. The dragon moved with a speed that made its size feel impossible. It did not step. It flowed. In a fraction of a second it bypassed Thomas entirely and lunged across the hangar, slamming its massive forelimbs onto the deck inches from where Sterling stood. Reinforced plating shattered. A shockwave knocked the site director flat on his back. The dragon towered over him. Its jaws opened, revealing rows of serrated teeth. Acidic drool hissed and smoked where it struck the floor. Then it roared, not a hiss, not a purr, but a deafening concussive blast of pure fury that shattered the remaining intact glass in the bay. Sterling scrambled backward, whimpering, a spreading stain of fear soaking through his trousers. Stop! The voice was tiny, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. Leo dropped Barnaby and ran forward. Before Thomas could even draw breath, the boy reached the dragon's hind leg and smacked its armored flank with one small hand. No. Bad, he scolded, brow furrowed in fierce 5-year-old authority. We do not yell at people. Leave him alone. The entire hangar held its breath. Victor gripped his rifle, certain he was watching the final mistake of a child who did not understand scale, rage, or death. Instead, the dragon stopped. It looked down at the tiny human slapping its leg. Then, slowly, almost apologetically, it stepped back from Sterling. Its head lowered. A strange, soft whining sound came from somewhere deep in its throat, closer to a scolded animal than a cosmic predator. It nudged Leo's shoulder gently with its snout. Victor lowered his weapon by degrees, his alien mind visibly struggling to process what stood before him. His species had spent thousands of years studying war, hierarchy, and the science of predation. But humanity possessed something he had never properly understood until that moment. Humans had a pathological need to pack bond with the universe. They could look at a walking extinction event, decide it was lonely, and somehow force reality itself to make room for that decision. Nobody shoots, Thomas said at last, his voice finding strength again. He glared at Sterling, who was still trembling on the floor. Nobody makes a sudden movement. The beast stays with the boy. We clear Sector 4 and make a habitat. Until rescue arrives, my son is the only thing keeping us alive. 3 weeks followed. Outpost 31 transformed from a mining facility into something stranger, a terrifying sanctuary built around a miracle nobody fully understood. The dragon, whom Leo officially named Buster, claimed the primary cargo bay as its den. It refused the cryogenic chamber. Climate controls were rerouted. Victor's warriors stood guard, no longer merely hired security, but witnesses to something that had shattered their worldview. But peace, Thomas knew, had only bought them time. And time was exactly what corporate power never allowed to remain innocent. 3 weeks passed, and Outpost 31 became the strangest sanctuary in the galaxy. The primary cargo bay, once built for freight loaders and extraction pallets, now belonged to Buster. The dragon refused to return to the cryogenic chamber, and after the first day no one had been foolish enough to try forcing the issue. Under Thomas Harding's supervision, engineers rerouted the station's climate controls to keep the bay warm enough for the beast's comfort. Under Victor's armed watch, every worker on the outpost learned a new law without ever seeing it written. Whatever peace existed on Aegis 2 existed only because a 5-year-old child could walk up to the deadliest creature in the universe and make it purr. Leo accepted all of this with the effortless practicality only children possessed. He did not see a world-ending apex predator when he looked at Buster. He saw a very large friend who liked Barnaby, hated the cold room, and had not yet figured out how fetch was supposed to work. Thomas watched from behind a reinforced blast shield as the dragon spent impossible stretches of time delicately trying to pick up blocks, tools, and pieces of scrap with claws built to tear armored vehicles apart, just to pass them back to Leo. When the boy slept curled in blankets in the middle of the bay, Buster coiled its 40-foot body around him in a fortress of obsidian scales and living heat. It was absurd. It was terrifying. It was also the only reason anyone on the station was still alive. The silicates changed even more than the humans did. To them, the dragon had always belonged to myth, a god of death, a biological apocalypse, something their oldest records remembered with the kind of cultural horror usually reserved for the end of worlds. To watch that same beast brought to heel not by plasma fire or superior force, but by a child with soft hands and a stuffed dog, shattered something fundamental in them. Victor and his men stopped treating Leo like a tolerated human dependent. They began treating him with reverence. They bowed their heads when they passed the cargo bay. In their own language, they stopped calling him Leo and began calling him the Sun Tamer. Thomas should have known peace like that would not last. On the 21st day, the proximity alarms started wailing again. A massive shadow eclipsed the external camera feeds as a Hastings Interstellar corporate dreadnought descended through the moon's thin atmosphere. Thomas stood in the command center, stomach knotting into something hard and cold, and watched the tactical display populate with docking signals and weapon signatures far too heavy for any rescue mission. He had known Arthur Sterling had managed to send a scrambled burst transmission before Buster severed the main communications grid, but he had not expected a response of this scale. The ship settling over Aegis II was not a relief vessel. It was a retrieval force. Within an hour, the dreadnought had locked onto the outpost's docking ring. The airlock hissed open, and a column of armored corporate operatives marched inside wearing matte tactical suits and carrying heavy neural disruptor rifles. At their head walked Director William Rohr, a man with dead eyes and the kind of clean, practiced ruthlessness that made Arthur Sterling look amateur by comparison. He did not waste time on greetings. "Dr. Harding," he said, stepping straight into Thomas's space. "You've done an impressive job keeping the asset intact. We will take over from here." "The asset?" Thomas repeated. He took a step forward, fists already clenched. "Listen to me, Rohr. You cannot move that creature. It has formed an unbreakable psychological bond with my son. If you try to cage it, it will tear this station apart." Rohr smiled thinly, patronizingly, like a man indulging an unstable employee. "We are fully aware of the situation." Director Sterling's reports were detailed. The beast's attachment to the child is precisely what makes it viable. We couldn't transport it when it was a waking nightmare. A compliant, docile weapon is worth billions. Victor stepped from the shadows then, his 7-foot frame rising behind Thomas like a wall of armored judgment. "You do not understand the balance here, human," he said. "The beast is not tame. It is merely humoring the child. If you threaten the boy or attempt to force the creature, you will awaken the World Eater." Rohr barely looked at him. "Stand down, mercenary. Your contract is terminated." Then he turned to the strike team behind him. "Commander Hayes, execute Protocol Delta. Secure the asset." Thomas felt all the blood drain from his face. He knew Protocol Delta. "No," he said immediately. "Protocol Delta requires separating the biological tether. You can't use my son as bait." "Restrain him," Rohr said. 2 operatives seized Thomas by the arms before he could reach the doorway. He thrashed and shouted until one of them nearly tore his shoulder from its socket, dragging him backward. Commander Hayes and 12 elite operatives moved toward the cargo bay carrying industrial-grade neural inhibitor nets designed to short-circuit the nervous systems of megafauna. They did not need lethal weapons. In their minds, this was already solved. The creature had been made manageable by a child. They were about to learn the difference between calm and control. Inside the cargo bay, Leo sat cross-legged on the floor trying to teach Buster how to play fetch with a wrench. The dragon's head snapped up the moment the blast doors opened. Its body did not growl. It did not roar. It simply changed. The lazy, restful posture vanished and was replaced by the coiled stillness of a predator preparing to kill. In one fluid motion, Buster stepped over Leo, shielding the boy completely with its massive front limbs as Hayes barked, "Target the sensory nodes. Fire the inhibitors." The piece ended there. 6 neural inhibitor nets cracked across the cargo bay in a storm of blue-white electricity. They struck Buster squarely in the chest and neck, wrapping his black scales in coils of millions of volts meant to shut down the nervous system of anything large enough to frighten an armored man. Hayes had deployed them against megafauna on colony worlds, rogue war beasts, and engineered predators sold to private militaries. Against any normal biological entity, the voltage would have dropped the target into instant helplessness. Against Buster, it did almost nothing. The dragon looked down at the sparking nets clinging to its body as if trying to understand why the tiny painful insects had been thrown at it. For one heartbeat it seemed merely confused. Then it looked up. Not at the men. At the weapons raised toward Leo. That was the moment the entire room changed shape. The corporate strike teams still thought they were executing a containment procedure. Thomas, dragged helplessly in the command center with Roar's operatives pinning his arms, knew better. They had not disrupted a manageable animal. They had threatened something the dragon had decided belonged to it. To every arrogant adult in the building, Leo had been the tether. To Buster, Leo had become something much older, deeper, and more absolute than that. But the dragon screamed. It was not a roar. Not really. It was a sound so filled with cosmic fury that Thomas would remember it until the day he died. Buster's molten gold eyes flared with blinding light, and the temperature in the cargo bay spiked instantly. The inhibitor nets melted off his body into bubbling slag that hissed against the metal floor. Hayes staggered back a step, the confidence draining out of him so fast it was almost visible. "Fall back," he shouted. "Lethal force, lethal." He never finished the order. The World Eater had awakened again, and this time it was not protecting itself. It was protecting its child. Buster did not lunge first. That was the most horrifying part. There was intelligence in the way he moved now, cold and precise. He understood line of sight. He understood trajectories. He understood that the tiny human beneath his chest was fragile. With a blur of muscular grace too fast for a creature that size, Buster swept his armored tail around Leo and scooped the boy behind a stack of reinforced titanium shipping crates, shielding him completely from the firing line before the first rifle fully came up. Then Hayes' squad opened fire. 12 elite corporate operatives unleashed a torrential storm of armor-piercing rounds. The noise became a deafening metallic thunder that shook the foundations of the bay. On any natural creature, that volume of concentrated fire would have liquefied organs and shattered bone. On Buster, it did little more than throw sparks from his scales and ruin the polish of his armor. He lowered his head into the gunfire, eyes narrowing into incandescent slits of rage. Then he answered. The dragon released a high-frequency acoustic pulse that visibly rippled the air. Helmet visors shattered. Acoustic dampeners blew out. Several operatives dropped to their knees clutching bleeding ears as the scream of the pulse went straight through armor and into flesh. The neat geometry of Hayes' assault line broke apart immediately. Men stumbled. A few turned blindly. One fired into the ceiling. Another shot a crate instead of the target. The squad was still trying to understand what had happened when Buster hit them. He did not swat them aside like insects. He dismantled them. His jaws snapped forward, bypassing the heaviest armor on the nearest operative and crushing the man's kinetic battery pack instead. The localized explosion blasted 3 others off their feet. One of Buster's forelimbs lashed out, claws slicing through impact-resistant plating as if it were soaked paper. Another operative tried to flank left and disappeared beneath a sweep of black motion that shattered both his legs before hurling him into a loader column. Blood and burning circuitry filled the air together. A severed rifle spun end over end across the floor and skidded to a stop in a puddle of smoking coolant. In the command center above, the tactical feed flickered violently every time Buster moved, as though the dragon's own biology was emitting an electromagnetic distortion field. Director William Roar stared at the monitors with widening horror. "This is impossible," he whispered. Then he grabbed Thomas Harding by the front of his lab coat, yanked him close, and shoved a silver sidearm beneath his chin. "Call it off," Roar hissed. "Tell the boy to call it off, or I will paint this console with your brains." Despite the gun trembling under his jaw, Thomas let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You arrogant fool," he said. "You think Leo commands it like a circus animal? He didn't tame it. He just offered it kindness. You came in here and threatened its child. There is no off switch for what you've just woken up." Down in the arterial corridors outside the cargo bay, Hastings' reinforcements were already pouring out of the Deadliest airlocks, heavily armed and rushing to support Hayes' failing team. But they found their path blocked by Victor. The towering Silicate chief stood in the center of the main corridor with Gideon and the remaining alien mercenaries behind him, plasma rifles charged and aimed squarely at the advancing humans. The lead Hastings captain shouted for them to move aside and stop interfering with corporate retrieval. Victor reached up, detached the Hastings insignia from his chest plate, and let it fall to the grated floor with a sharp metallic clatter. "We are not mercenaries anymore," he said, his synthesized voice booming with cold resolve. "We are the vanguard of the Sun Tamer, and you will not touch his guardian." Then Victor opened fire. 6 agonizing days passed before outside help finally arrived. When the United Nations Extraterrestrial Charter Fleet dropped out of slipspace above Aegis II, Admiral James Caldwell expected to find a sterilized disaster zone. The telemetry bursts intercepted before the destruction of the Deadliest painted the outline of catastrophe clearly enough. A corporate dreadnought shattered in orbit, a research outpost nearly destroyed, and somewhere below it all a world-ending biological predator that had once been trapped in ice and was now loose. Caldwell came prepared for a massacre. His peacekeepers descended in heavy dropships with rifles raised, tactical formations locked, and every mind braced for the kind of nightmare soldiers spent careers trying not to imagine. What they found instead stopped them cold. The outer perimeter of the ruined facility was not held by human survivors, nor was it overrun by a rampaging beast. It was held by Silicate mercenaries, Victor and what remained of his vanguard, standing in cracked and scorched armor with their drained plasma rifles lowered but ready. They did not aim at the UNEC forces. They simply refused to move aside. Their discipline was absolute. Their loyalty had shifted so completely that even the Admiral could feel it before anyone explained a word. "I am Admiral Caldwell, United Nations Interstellar Fleet," he called, stepping past his own line of troops. "I'm looking for the facility director, Arthur Sterling, or the executive officer of the Deadliest." Victor looked down at him with utter calm. "They are dead or they fled into the ice like cowards," the alien said. "I speak for the Vanguard. You have no authority here, Admiral. We answer only to Dr. Harding. And to the boy." The answer made no sense. Not until Caldwell stepped past the alien line and into the hangar. Then understanding hit him all at once. The bay was a graveyard of twisted titanium, shattered concrete, scorched plating, and emergency floodlights glowing amber through dust. But at its center, resting in a massive nest made from thermal blankets and salvaged banners, lay the World Eater itself, bandaged, coated in glowing blue bioresin, and very much alive. Wrapped against the side of that impossible creature, asleep with a worn stuffed dog pressed to his chest, was a 5-year-old human boy. One colossal tail curled protectively around him like a fortress wall. One razor-sharp claw rested so gently above his stomach that the contrast looked unreal. Behind Caldwell, hardened peacekeepers let out small involuntary sounds of disbelief. Dr. Thomas Harding emerged from a makeshift triage station nearby, one arm in a rigid splint, coat ruined, face older than it should have been. He held a mug of synthetic coffee in his good hand and managed a tired, crooked smile. "Admiral Caldwell, I presume," he said softly. "I'd ask you to tell your men to keep their voices down. Buster just managed to get back to sleep, and frankly, he's had a very rough week." The fallout was swift. Before rescue arrived, Thomas had recovered Director Rohr's encrypted data drives from the outpost servers. They contained everything Hastings Interstellar had tried to bury: illegal directives, suppressed weapons manifests, and the explicit audio order authorizing the Orion Protocol against civilians and station personnel. Within 2 months, Hastings was dismantled by tribunal action. Its stock collapsed. Its board was arrested. Its assets were seized for reparations. Arthur Sterling, who had survived by hiding in a geological bunker, was dragged out and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in an orbital penal colony. But the deepest change was not legal. It was cultural. When the security footage from Outpost 31 was declassified, the galaxy saw what had happened. They saw a tiny human child in blue pajamas walk up to the most lethal biological weapon in recorded history and cure its world-ending rage with a kiss on the snout. Alien scholars studied it. Military strategists dissected it. Entire species tried to understand how humanity had accomplished what force, science, and fear never could. The answer was far simpler than any of them wanted. A child had seen pain where everyone else saw a monster. And the universe had bent around that choice.